this year. Who attended first night downtown? Anyone? The Pier Aquarium hosted a labyrinth this year, and the theme of the labyrinth was climate change. We had students from Eckerd College actually develop messages that were streamed throughout the labyrinth related to climate change. And then we also had elementary school kids from our Title I schools decorate luminary bags that decorated the labyrinth as well. So it was a wonderful project. We've taken that theme, we're bringing it to you tonight, and anticipate an interesting and lively conversation, to say the least, about this environmental issue. First, I'd like to recognize our sponsors for this evening, the American Chemical Society and our food partner, the Hangar Restaurant Light Lounge. We have Steve Westfall over here. And his lovely St. Nancy. We'd also like to thank Dave and Elizabeth and all the Hangar staff for accommodating us tonight. I'd also like to thank Jeff Wolf over here. Jeff, raise your hand. Jeff? For those of you who have attended side cafes in the past, one of the major issues we've always had is with our PA system. Tonight we're borrowing Jeff's PA system. Hopefully this is much better than what we used in the past. Can everyone hear us in the back? Mark, can you hear me at the bar? Can you hear me over there at the bar? Perfect, perfect. All right. So thank you, Jeff. Thank you. The two words climate change have different meanings for different people, and people have different opinions, obviously, about this. People react with caution, fear, skepticism, or not at all. You know, tonight's theme, we said, is Al Gore right? Does climate change exist? Should we be concerned living on a coastal city? We also have Frank Muller-Carter. Where's Frank? Frank is the director of the International Oceans Institute here in St. Pete. And in 2012, we're going to be hosting the second annual Coastal City Summit that deals with climate change issues. So if you're interested, please talk to Frank afterwards. And what should we do living in a coastal city? We hope that tonight's Side Cafe will clarify the controversy. And our format tonight, if you haven't been to a Side Cafe before, this is very informal. This is not a lecture. We're here to have one-way, two-way, three-way, four-way conversation with everyone. So we're going to briefly introduce the topic. We'll take questions from the audience, and then we hope the discussion continues afterwards over a drink. I affectionately call it a drinking thing. So we encourage you to stay as long as you'd like, and our panelists and our moderator would stay as well, as long as you have questions or opinions. Speakers will speak for about 5 minutes. We'll be moderated by Dr. David Hollander here. And then afterwards, again, we'll take questions, and I'll walk around with the mic. David will acknowledge people. And then Emily, where's Emily over here, is going to ring the bell if she feels you're talking too long, or if the panelists are talking too long. We also have an exercise for all of you to participate in. I love it. I love it. Emily's making me say all this. Afterwards, we have an exercise for everyone to participate in. As I mentioned, at the first night in Labyrinth, we had a series of 8 suggested actions that we wanted our participants to say, I want to take this action or that action or this action. Emily, where are those?
They're on that back table.
Okay, they're on the back table. Before you leave, after the discussion, we'd like for you to put a tick mark next to the action that you would like to take over the next year. That would hopefully offset or impact
your carbon footprint.
Your carbon footprint.
And we will compare these results with the people who attended our labyrinth and voted during first night. So it'll be interesting. We had about 2,000 people who voted, so it'll be interesting.
Yeah, so please check our website for the results. www.pureaquarium.org. Our moderator tonight is David Hollander. David is an associate professor of chemical oceanography at the University of South Florida, College of Marine Science. You can see our College of Marine Science right behind us in the vista here. Dr. Hollander researches how biological, chemical, and physical processes and modern environments control the production, composition, alteration, decomposition, and preservation of organic matter. We'll talk more about that. This research couples state-of-the-art analytical techniques and stable isotopes and organic geochemistry to provide a detailed characterization of organic matter. Our panelists. Oh, give a round of applause for Dr. David Hollander. panelists include Benjamin Flower. Dr. Flower is an associate professor of paleoceanography and paleoclimatology. Dr. Flower's research focuses on the role of ocean circulation in past global climate change. He uses ocean sediment cores to examine the causes and effects of natural climate variability. The composition and geochemistry of ocean sediments are used to reconstruct sea surface temperature, salinity, carbon chemistry, and even iceberg delivery. Dr. Flower is currently working on several projects which include climatic and hydrologic variability in the Gulf of Mexico and Florida since the last glacial maximum, the role of Laurentide ice sheet meltwater in abrupt climate change, that's a mouthful, solar radiance forcing of iceberg delivery and climate in the North Atlantic, and the impact of the BP oil spill on sediments and benthic communities on the West Florida shelf and slope. Dr. Shin, Eugene Shin, is also one of our panelists. He's a Curtis Professor of Geology at the University of South Florida College of Marine Science. And Dr. Shin recently retired as a research geologist from one of our partners, the United States Geological Survey, where he started and directed the Fisher Island Station off of Miami. He did extensive geological research, including coral reefs, carbonate sediment production, Pleistocene geology, and environmental effects of offshore petroleum drilling. Before that, he had a 15-year career as a research geologist with Shell Oil Company, working in Florida, the Bahamas, the Persian Gulf, and Holland. His specialty at present is to study the effects of African dust on downwind ecosystems, including Caribbean coral reefs. So, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Hollander, and I'll be back with you at the end.
Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to thank Howard, Emily, and the Sci Cafe for the invitation. I appreciate it, and thank you, everybody, for coming. I think the concept of climate change is highly, it's a highly charged word. And the idea is that if climate change actually is occurring, the impact to the world can be severe. Not only is the idea that large climate changes or large levels of sea level would cause variability, but predictions of relatively modest changes are going to cause significant changes to our business as usual, our scenario of economic viability, whether it be through agriculture, whether it be through land use alteration changes. There's going to be significant variations that can manifest themselves into a circumstance where there's an enormous amount of economic impact that is going to result from this. So the question is, if we believe that climate change is going to happen, what are we going to do about it? We realize that the idea of greenhouse gases, the idea that carbon dioxide specifically generated from fossil fuels is primarily the driving force, then one has to believe we have to alter that. But it's a debate whether that is actually driving the climate or not. And I think our story comes back today to the Al Gore question of whether climate change is actually happening or not. And I think many people have to set back in two dimensions. And a lot of things are very localized. Whether it's happening to you or whether it's not happening to you in your local neighborhood is really an important feature of whether you believe in climate change. I just read recently Norfolk, Virginia has waterfront areas that are now, sea level is actually encroaching on these neighborhoods, and they're having to change infrastructure and accommodate these populations. So there's going to be, if one believes that there is going to be climate change, are we going to accommodate these changes? And if it's CO2 that's driving the environmental changes, are we going to change our energy policy, or are we going to continue our energy policy? We realize that there's a finite amount of fossil fuels, and the idea of us going to the end of the road and utilizing all of them and still not having a solution is sort of a scary result. And I think we first have to determine whether climate change is really a viable perspective. And not only is it a question of local versus if it's happening to you or not, but it's also the time scale that you're looking at. Of course, we're going to talk about time scales today significantly because it depends upon if you're looking to the long future or to the short future. We hear a lot in our political rhetoric today about We don't want to leave the world in a condition or in a country that is not passable to our grandchildren, our ancestors. And if we look at climate change in that sort of perspective, would that create a priority within society to change some of the behavior that we recognize may be part of the impact of climate change? So I guess the debate really starts is, do we believe climate change is actually occurring today? I think that's really one of the first large questions. So I think I'll just pass it to Ben to kick this off. We're going to have sort of the concept of there's a for and actually against climate change scenario, and this always is part of the debate, which is really maybe not part of the consensus scientifically. Is that you actually have to have a plus side and a minus side, or a for and against. And that's exactly what we're going to have tonight. But the question is, does the science drive a consensus that it's for, agree with that there is climate change, or argue against climate change?
Well, I would like to start with two questions for the audience. The first is, can you all hear me? The first question is has global climate warmed since the year 1800? How many would say yes, global climate has warmed since the year 1800? Okay. 72%, I think. You might be interested to know that this question was asked of a group of 3,000 scientists, and 90% of the scientists said yes to that question. Only 58% of the public said yes to that question. So there's a real disconnect here. And right from the beginning, I think this speaks to a level of responsibility that we have in the researcher world to communicate better with the public. Okay. The second question that was asked in this same survey was, is human activity a significant contributing factor? So how many would say, yes, human activity has been a significant contributing factor? 74%. Yes, about 97% of active climate scientists said yes to that question. So now this survey that I mentioned was conducted 2 years ago, and the respondents spanned the range of scientists. Okay, there were experts in the field of climatology. There were non-experts, but experts in other areas of science, and the whole gamut. Okay, so I want to give you some numbers, some examples here of the active climate scientists, and these are people that are actively publishing and working on this issue. As I say, 97% of them said yes to that question. Significantly, only 64% of meteorologists said yes to that question. So this brings up the second point, and that is that climate is not weather. Okay. It might be tempting to say that today is an example of what we might see in terms of extreme events in the future, but I'm not going to say that, because this is a weather event. And for convenience, something in the order of 15 years might be the cutoff point between where weather becomes climate. Okay. Also significantly, the group of scientists that said yes to this question with the lowest percentage was the economic geologists. Okay, only 47% of economic geologists said yes to that question. So there's a real discrepancy among scientists, all right? But the big discrepancy is between scientists and the public. So the second issue, I wanted to make 2 points at this point. One is that there's well-demonstrated evidence from thermometers that the entire Earth's surface has warmed in the mean by about 0.7 degrees since the beginning of the 20th century. Okay, so since 1900, the entire globe has warmed on average about 0.7 degrees Celsius. That's about 1.1 degrees Fahrenheit, if you can't do the conversion in your head, which I cannot. This doesn't sound like a large temperature change, but it amounts to 10 to the 22nd joules, which I also had to look up. That turns out that is about 40 times the mean global energy consumption. Okay, that's how much energy has gone into a global warming of 0.7 degrees C, and that is just the beginning. But we'll get back to that. The second point I'd like to make is in terms of CO2. So in terms of climate change, I think the evidence is incontrovertible that there has been a mean change of 0.7 degrees C. Okay. Human activity is a significant contributor to this by means of CO2 rise, CO2 into the atmosphere, and also deforestation, okay, burning of tropical rainforests. And now, I do have to say that the greenhouse is our friend in a sense. The Earth's surface will be 32 degrees colder if we had no greenhouse effect. Okay, keep that in mind. So when we talk about CO2, adding more CO2 to the atmosphere, we're talking about enhancing an existing greenhouse effect. Okay. Now we have enhanced it. Today's measurement, as you may know, is greater than 390 parts per million by volume CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, just for comparison, at the last glacial maximum, it was only 190, and prior to the Industrial Revolution, it was 280. Okay, so the total range, glacial to interglacial, okay, about 90 ppm, and we've exceeded that range just in the anthropogenic era. Important to keep in mind the scale here. So now we're not talking about 0.7 degrees, we're talking about a magnitude of CO2 input to the atmosphere that is greater than glacial interglacial changes. And that has been documented back to ice as old as nearly 1 million years ago. So in other words, in the last 1 million years, it has never been higher than 280, except for the 20th century. Okay, this is important to keep in mind. Lastly, we care in Florida about sea level. Tide gauges, and confirmed by satellite records now, have shown that in the 20th century, sea level rose by about 18 centimeters. Again, may not sound like a whole lot, but here's where we get to something that Dr. Hollander brought up. Let me finish this thought, okay? And that is that this rate is more than 5 times slower than what was observed when we came out of the last glaciation. So in other words, the climate system is capable of much more rapid changes than what we saw in the 20th century. And indeed, in some parts of the deglaciation, it was about 20 times, at least 20 times slower than what we had observed. In the deglaciation, it was 20 times faster than what we have observed in the 20th century. So the climate system seems to be capable of abrupt changes. And so these are some discussion points, I think, that we can continue. But I do need to say one last thing, and that is the climate change skeptics will tell you that their main concern is it's the sun. Okay, it's not CO2, it's the sun that causes this. And I'm prepared in the Q&A session to talk about why we know that's not the case.
Yes, thank you. I'm looking out there at the water rising, and I just want to remind people that we were here about 125,000 years ago. We probably have our feet in the water way up here. And that's when this peninsula formed. And it's also when the Florida Keys formed 125,000 years ago. And that seems like a long time for most of you. The Keys are very precarious. If we did a study down there. If you raise sea level 1 meter, 75% of the land runs underwater. Just a few of the bridges that we stay on. Then just 16,000 years ago, sea level was down maybe 400 feet. We had to go 100 miles offshore out here to find the ocean. And so those are extreme changes, and there were extreme temperature changes, and there weren't any SUVs around, so it's hard to blame that on the usual suspects, as I call them. I always get cast into being the bad guy in these kind of things. And I'd like to explain how this all happened. And I did a lot of work on sea level in the past, but I didn't project. I don't get into models and so on. I worked for the USGS, worked on coral reefs and so on. And when I retired, Chip Groth, our former director, called me from Texas, and he conned me into being on a big committee. And this committee is the Climate Change Committee for the American Association of Petroleum Geologists. So I can imagine what a lot of people are thinking when you hear that. I've been a member of that organization for about 35 years and so on. But I couldn't say no. And I want you to know this was not a committee of a bunch of good old boys. I was pleasantly surprised. And I'd like to tell people that our committee was like a marriage made in hell. We had one end of the spectrum on one end of the table, and we had the other at the other end. And one of those at the other end was a fellow named Eric Barron, who graduated from the University of Miami. I knew him when he was a graduate student. He moved around a lot of places, ended up at the University of Texas, and he got onto this committee. And after a while, he left there and went to NCAR, the National Climate Center in Boulder, where he was director of this thing. And about a year ago, he left there, and he's now the president of Florida State University. And he's here in town raising money. But I don't think it was for the football team. So that's how I got involved in it. So I went in sitting in the middle. I'm not a climatologist, but I'm a natural born skeptic. And I listen to people at this end of the table and people at that end of the table. So I agreed that I can give that side of the table story for the purposes of this debate we're having here tonight. Where else should I go in that? Is my 5 minutes up yet?
No, you can
All right, well, we can...
But you do have to, I have to go back and answer Ben's first two questions with a yes, because the first question was, is it getting warmer? Well, we've been coming out of the little ice age, and before that we were coming out of the last glacial period. So naturally it's been warmer. I've got the second question. Is there human, well, there probably is, but I'll talk about people on the right end of the table. They would say that CO2 is the minor element, that there's something else going on. And I think we'll get into that a little bit more as we go tonight.
You got another 40 seconds.
20 seconds, what can I say in 20 seconds?
40.
We can just...
Yeah.
Let's just get to...
I did insist that we have a hockey stick, because everybody's heard of the famous hockey stick curve that Al Gore uses in his movie, and did, and this showed sea level temperatures going up starting about 1980. But from about 1940 to the late 1970s, the temperature was actually dropping. Now, Ben mentioned the difference between weather and climate. Climate, by definition, is 30 years of weather. And the problem is you can pick that where you want to start and stop that 30 years. So a lot of people pick the spot that makes it tell the story they want to tell. So, there you go.
Thank you.
Well, again, I didn't mean to cast you as the bad guy, so... Sorry. Well, I think there is the really debate about whether or not climate change is man-made or not. I think we recognize that climate has varied over time. I think the real question with it coming to a man-made issue comes back to how fast things are changing. Can we look at climate variability in the past and truly recognize that it is CO2 concentrations are increasing faster than that? Or do you believe that the complexity of the climate system is such that it buries these kind of variability?
That's a tough one, because if you look at the data from the ice cores, the Vostok pool and so on, they're showing a rapid rise in temperature and then a slowing down. It's like a sawtooth. And most recent data shows that the temperature precedes the rise in CO2. Now, I'm old-fashioned. I like cause and effect. And so if temperature is going up faster than the CO2 by about 1,000 years, I worry about that. Now, the global warmists, they don't have a problem with that because there's a lot of feedback and stuff going on. But I'm just old-fashioned. I like to see this causes this, that does that, and so on. Very simple. What was the question?
Do you believe, looking at the rates of change, that
yeah, well,
you can link
this is
climate?
the standard answer that we've never seen the rate of change as fast as it is now. I don't know if the resolution of the ice cores is that precise that we can really tell. But I guess a bigger question is, should we consider CO2 a pollutant? Ben mentioned it's about 390 parts per million in the atmosphere today. If we had a little meter here to measure what's going on in this room, I'll bet you it's up around 1,000 parts per million. And I don't think anybody's suffering. If you, I know that in our Navy submarines,
I don't know.
Okay.
they have a little gauge that doesn't even sound off till it gets up to 6,000 parts per million. And next time you give artificial respiration, just remember that it's about 30,000 parts per million CO2 you're breathing into this person's mouth. So calling it a pollutant is, I don't know, it's just a little strange to me. It sounds awful political.
I think that
I'm speaking about people on the right-hand side of the table.
I should probably say something about the rates of CO2 change. So just to underline that the transition from about 280 to 390 today, that's over 100 units of CO2 change, has happened in less than 150 years, and perhaps call it a century. And it took, in contrast, about 10,000 years to change from a glacial time to an interglacial time. So the rates are clearly much faster today. The other thing is, there's no argument with what Gene mentioned, that temperature may have preceded CO2 change in the past, but that's not the experiment that we're conducting right now. So when we pump CO2 into the atmosphere, we know it's a very strong greenhouse gas, and it has the effect of enhancing water vapor in the atmosphere and doubling its effect right there. Okay? So CO2 has its own positive feedbacks, and the biggest one being enhancement by other greenhouse gases, especially water vapor. And this has been known, by the way, for a long time. I think 96 was the first paper that was published on this that quantified this effect. That's 1896, okay? When Arrhenius first quantified the relationship between CO2 and temperature change. So we know that this is a physical effect that goes with many other greenhouse gases, and you have other feedbacks. For example, one of the most important feedback is the ice albedo feedback. Okay, at high latitudes where you have snow and ice that reflect sunlight, the effect is less in terms of heat absorbed by the Earth. You remove some of that snow and ice, albedo or reflectivity goes down, the Earth gains more heat. This is a very strong positive feedback, and it's part of the reason why the Arctic sea ice is disappearing at alarming rates. So the other thing I should say, one last thing about the pollutant issue. So there's an interesting comparison in the 70s and 80s. Everyone has heard of Freon, right? Well, a dangerous chlorofluorocarbon, dangerous because it breaks down ozone in the atmosphere. It gives you ozone hole and enhances the receipt of ultraviolet rays, which is nasty for skin cancer, etc. So up until the mid-'80s, DuPont was actively questioning the science behind this. Okay, DuPont was the maker of Freon, and in the '80s, their engineers managed to produce a new compound, a hydrofluorocarbon, which did not have a greenhouse effect. I'm sorry, did not have an effect on the ozone. Excuse me. And so they completely changed their tune in the mid-'80s, okay, as a result of technology. I think we have a comparison here. If the energy industry can come up with other sources of energy or sources in addition to carbon, this has precedent. Okay. In fact, DuPont was one of the champions of the so-called Montreal Protocol, which in the mid-'80s determined that it would be a good idea to reduce chlorofluorocarbons in the atmosphere. And indeed, that change has continued. The CFCs are much less than they were without this agreement.
Yeah, I think we're getting into the right sort of direction for the discussion. About the carbon dioxide, if we believe that climate change is occurring, and if we accept that, we may be willing to bet the farm that it isn't, but if we're not willing to bet the farm that it isn't, and that CO2 is actually one of the drivers with all its feedbacks, and we recognize that a runaway CO2 would cause unprecedented, or it's speculated it would cause unprecedented damage, the complexity of the Earth system, what we understand is such that we'd be recognizing what the impacts would be, and they'd be severe. So is it an imperative that we change the energy policy? Is this something that has to happen unless we are willing to go to the end of our carbon budget, essentially? Are we going to wait till the end? Or how are we going to resolve this issue?
I think we're probably too broke to fix it right now, but and going back to the people at the right-hand end of that table I was telling you about, one of the things they kept pointing out, and which I've seen published a lot recently, is that the relationship between rising temperature and rising CO2 is not a straight line. It's a negative logarithmic thing. So you get up to about 600 parts per million, it's likely to flatten out, and we won't see much continued rise in temperature at that point.
Likely is a tough word.
Yeah, it really is. Now, I see some gray hairs around out here, and I'm sure there are people that remember the early 1970s when we were told that we were going into another ice age. I remember the headline on Time magazine, and even Steve Snyder, who became a big proponent of warming, back then was saying, yeah, we're going into an ice age. And I have this wonderful old Leonard Nimoy and search up program on my computer that explains how we're going into another ice age. And it ends with the famous geologist at Lamont Doherty pulling his cores out, talking in the camera, and the cameraman said, well, what do they show you? The camera said, these cores say we're going into another ice age. So that's what scientists tell us.
I should respond to this one since this is directly my field. Thanks for setting me up. Yes, Gene is correct for the long term. Okay, it's going to take about 50,000 years. So if that means if that means an imminent ice age to you, fair enough. But what Gene's talking about is the Earth-Sun relationship and the seasonality of insolation that's received by the Earth. That geometry is going to change on the course of the next tens of thousands of years, not in the next 1,000 years, certainly not in the next 100 years. This is not a factor on the time scales of 100 to 1,000 or even 10,000 years.
Yeah, it comes back again to timescales. Is there any questions directly related to this? Yes. Hold on.
There seems to be an awful lot of looking to science to say we should or shouldn't do something. Are there downsides to taking a proactive measure today without regard for whether we're guaranteed it might work, but might have other side effects like lowering costs of energy, like maybe making the atmosphere a little cleaner. I come from coal country, so I know what happens when there's mining going on around you and what your windowsills, to say nothing of your lungs, look like. There are other things that might change if we did some proactive stuff. Is there a reason we can't do that too?
What I hear from the climate change skeptics is it would be too expensive. That's the line that we hear in response to that question. And I would counter that by saying a small investment now may be a good insurance policy. Now, I am not a policy scientist, so, and you know, it's not within my normal comfort zone to talk about policy, to talk about what we should or shouldn't do. But I find that, you know, the amount of disinformation out there is really growing, and I find it ethically important for me to speak up with what I do know. And I would agree with you. I think that we need some kind of insurance policy. Even if it is not likely to be catastrophic, we need to take steps, in my opinion, to mitigate.
Yeah. In answer to that question, I've been exposed to more of the policy sort of aspects of the problem. And, you know, what I hear is that, like I said earlier, we're about broke. It's not the right time for this country to do an awful lot, because we're talking about things that are very expensive. I had some other thoughts about that. It is expensive, and the problem is, if we try and jump into alternative fuels right away, which I guarantee you we're not going to do for the next 20 or 30 years, it'll be a slow process. We drive up the price of conventional fuel, and can we afford the increase in the price of conventional fuels to run the trucks on the highways and so on?
One thing to your question, I mean, I think there is a point, there is a crossing point when the search for resources turns out to be economically not feasible, whether it be the reward from them is relatively low, like the tar sands up in Canada, or that you're in such deep water that some of the risks for some disasters are just too much to insure. And there is some trading, there is some point where they cross, where the investment in the alternatives are going to become a value. It's what risk do you want to take? Where is your comfort zone? And I have some sympathy about not wanting to bet the farm that nothing is going to happen, or that there's a plateau at 600 and everything it's likely to be okay. I think there is reason to be concerned about the role of some of these gases in the climate system. And again, it doesn't have to be catastrophic. These could be regional scale changes in rainfall. They can be manifested, again, in wet or dry conditions and changes very little. So I think there is a point, at some economic point, where it becomes the value. I think the technology, and we hear it constantly, there is new technology, but I don't know if we can rely on technological breakthrough, or we're going to have to rely on technological breakthrough, but we have to keep investing. And again, there are new technologies and different technologies out there that are not traditional ones that we're talking about now, ones that are still in research incubators, that are much more energy or energy conducting than some of the alternative techniques that we're using today. Some people would argue that for Florida, even solar, wind, and wave energy is still not enough to support our energy needs. So this is a real debate. I think there are stopgaps that some of the alternative energy may be able to provide. Other countries have adopted nuclear. Is nuclear something that we're willing to think about as a compromise to a climate driven by CO2 and fossil fuel? These are debates that other countries are having as well.
So my question relates to how good are predictive tools regarding climate change. And you've spoken, both of you have been speaking about feedback loops. There are positive and negative feedback loops with respect to increased CO2 levels. One that I've read about, I'm not a scientist, but one that I've read about is increased CO2, increased oceanic plankton perhaps, and also increase the efficiency of green land forms. We'll have more food, atmospheric food. But my general question is, how confident are we in our climate model so that we know that we're looking at a definite direction, not just a blip? These are long-term changes normally.
Well, I don't know about Ben.
Did you understand the question?
I don't think we're that competent. I'm just naturally suspicious of models. You can find many examples where models didn't do the job, and it's always because you never have enough data to put in it, or you find something else that you needed. And then there's the question of, is there any fudging going on with what numbers you use to put in the models? That's what I hear at the right end of that mythical table I kept mentioning. So I don't have a lot of confidence in the models. Was there more of that question? Interesting about the plankton. In 1989, I wrote a little article, and I predicted that if we raised CO2, there'd be more plankton in the ocean. And I don't know if I was really believing it at the time, but makes sense. They're phytoplankton plants like CO2.
I'm sorry, Gene.
If I may, I should.
I'm sorry, Gene. This might be an opportunity to talk about the African dust that you're researching coming over and stimulating productivity in the ocean. No? Yes? As a possible sink of CO2? No?
Well, I gave a lecture on that to a sustainability class over at Nova University about a month ago, and 2 students showed up. But there was about 10 of us, and we really had a good time with it. Yes, I spent about 12 years on African dust, and this would take hours to talk about African dust. But the thing is, what I never did when I was promoting funding for the USGS, I never blamed it on climate change. There are other things causing desertization in North Africa, and of course a lot of. And in today's world, I could probably just be rolling in money if I blamed it on CO2 and temperature.
Well, I don't think that's a fair portrayal that if you're against it, you can get funding from federal agencies.
Well, that's the bottom line in everything we do is funding. But maybe we get into that later.
I should respond to the climate modeling question. So I'd like to make 2 points. And one is that there are a range of models with a range of sensitivities, okay? And one of the benchmarks for comparing models is the prediction for double pre-industrial atmospheric CO2 level. Okay, pre-industrial was about 280, as I mentioned, so doubling that would be 560. Models have a range of predicted global average temperature rises as a result of 560 ppm. And they center at about 3 degrees, but they're as low as 1.5 degrees. In other words, this is how much global climate will warm with a doubling of pre-industrial. Range from about 1.5 degrees up to 5.5 degrees, okay? So yes, you're right, there is a range of uncertainties in the models. We don't know whether the higher sensitivity models are correct or the lower or something right in the middle. And it turns out that Arrhenius, the fellow I mentioned who published his work in 1896, he said 3 degrees. So in a funny way, we haven't come a lot longer in 100 years or more. Second point I'd like to make is that we know in at least one instance that the models are not sensitive enough. Okay, and this is the case of the Arctic sea ice, okay, where it has, in the past decade or so, it's been reduced by something like 7%. And none of the models predicts this. Okay? None of the models, in terms of their response of that part of the world, are responding to global change. None of the models predicts that high of a sensitivity. Okay, so here's one case where the models are clearly not sensitive enough, and what we observe is worse than what any model predicted.
Yes.
I just wonder if there's CO2 warming, is the effect immediate? Can we measure it immediately, or is this something that over more time grows?
That's a good question.
Well, from what I've heard from the right-hand side of that table again, it would take 50 years for the current levels of CO2. Even if we stop making any tomorrow, it would take about 50 years before it comes down significantly. I don't know how much, but it's going to hang around for quite a while. Is that the question?
Well, I think, well, yes, the idea is that because CO2 is not going to disappear very quickly at all.
I'm not talking about
And
disappearing,
the
but
feedback that it has on the climate system.
The question is how quickly is temperature affected by the CO2?
And that's for your climate model.
The short answer is I don't know. I think it's mighty quick. Okay, I mean, CO2 kicks in the water vapor feedback and produces to a geologist an instantaneous response. Okay, but I do want to make a comment on the other piece of what you asked about, the fact that it hangs around. It turns out that because CO2 hangs around so long in the atmosphere, I mean on the order of centuries, that more than half of the warming is still in the pipeline. Okay? If, as Gene says, we were to stop CO2 emissions today, it would not have an immediate effect. We know this. It would continue to have effect for centuries, and some people would argue many millennia, okay, even if we stopped today. So it has a long tail. And that's not the case, incidentally, for water vapor. Water vapor disappears very quickly from the atmosphere. It's absorbed in the hydrologic system. CO2 stays in the atmosphere, so it's very different.
Yeah, one of the keys to this is that the surface ocean is like a lid, and so the circulation of the surface does not go very quickly into the deep ocean, so you can't put a lot of it into the deep ocean very quickly.
I'd recommend you go to the website called plantsneedco2.org, and I've got a lot of information from there. I know the fellow that started it, and so I know he's not lying. But you'll learn things about, all greenhouses pump the CO2 up to over 1,000 parts per million. It makes the plants grow better and they use less water. He would say, yeah, bring it on.
Before I ask the question, just a partial answer to hers, just from the information that's been presented. You're talking about going from 180 parts to 390 and increasing the temperature, mean temperature of the surface of the Earth by 1.1 degree. You're talking about going from 390 to 560 and tripling. So I would say, in answer to Richard's question, it is an acceleration factor. It's not a straight line progression. But in the meantime, the question, given that CO2 does have a warming effect, given that fossil fuels create CO2, and given that stripping the rainforests, which would absorb some of that CO2, or increasing the amount of CO2 every minute, every day, those kinds of things are reasonably factual. Since Jimmy Carter's administration, they've been talking about alternative energy because we have a finite amount of fossil fuels, which is one of the things that you mentioned. It strikes me that we should, for the last 40 years, have been developing this, not like immediately, but working on it during that period of time. I mean, we've done buckets. We've done very, very little. It just doesn't make sense to me, and I think it's because of the people who employ the economic geologists, which are, you know, the oil and gas people. They don't want alternative energy until then, because by then they'll have enough money, they don't care.
Yeah.
It's the need for an energy policy.
Yes.
Right. Well, I thought we'd start getting around to this because everyone likes to point out the AGWs, anthropogenic global warmers. That's the code from the people on the right hand of the table, about big left. They always like to say that oil companies are behind all this alternative fuels, against the whole story. I think if you look at the numbers, that in total, the government puts more money into climate research than the oil companies do. Of course, they have an obvious interest in this, the oil companies do, but governments, especially if you include Europe, remember the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Control, it's a government agency, it's picked by governments. So,
What about the Koch brothers? They
well,
have a lot of money.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who have a lot of money out there. And of course, there's George Soros and all those kind of people.
Let's talk
It's
climate.
it's a really tricky, and we're not really into climate business right now. But it is very political, as we started out right in the beginning. It's a very political issue. And I get tons of email every day. Oh, I didn't mention that committee I was on, after 4 years, it was dissolved. It was just getting to be too much of a problem for membership, 35,000 members of the American Association of Petroleum Geologists. We have 10 the younger people would say, if we don't address this problem, I'm quitting. And the older people would say, if we address this problem, I'm quitting. And so they're caught in this thing. That's why they created the committee to begin with, to try and solve this. And then eventually, I must say, all of our meetings were very civil, but there were things going on that the higher-ups did not like, and so they got rid of it. But there's an ad hoc group out there that sends me stuff all day long.
Another question.
Yeah, hi. It seems to me that any discussion of climate change has to talk about world population. I mean, later on this year, we're going to reach 7 billion people on this planet, 7 billion. And each one of those people is a consumer. And whether they leave a small carbon footprint or a large one, just by being human, you're a consumer. And in 20 years, they're predicting 9 billion people on the planet. And it seems to me that it's almost unsustainable now. And with those kind of numbers, I mean, how can we expect to reverse what seems to me to be an almost irreversible situation as far as climate change with that kind of population?
That's really scary.
Yeah, you're right.
Well, yeah, I think.
Does anybody have an answer for that?
Well, I think.
I mean,
but the idea of policy aspects, and I'm not a proponent of concepts of cap and trade, but there has to be some way that, if you think of the global system, if Americans, for example, make that initiative and they put that investment forward, there's not a lot of economic benefit to them, and the globe doesn't still recover. So it has to be something that has a policy or has a treaty that's global in nature. And at what point do people that are climbing up the ladder not or find some balance that they're happy with? Likewise, our energy consumption is enormous on a per capita basis.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a lot of compromise, I think, that has to be recognized.
But do you think there's enough time? I mean, that's my feeling is that we've reached a curve that maybe we've lost the fight. And all this discussion about different degrees of this and that is just blowing smoke. And we basically lost the battle because these huge numbers of people that are inhabiting the planet are consuming so much of the natural resources at such a rapid rate that
some people speculate, of course, that with a warming climate, there's going to be an advance of disease, and there could be a natural balance to the world. This is quite a long-lived concept of the Gaia hypothesis and James Lovelock. I mean, there's natural balances. I don't think we've ever experimented on that side, that the population of a single organism, obviously, it could be something that could be a reality.
That's what keeps me awake at night.
I can say two quick things in response to this, perhaps. First, I agree it is a global problem, and it is the poor countries that are going to suffer the most. For example, even a half-meter rise in sea level is going to displace several million people in Bangladesh. Okay, we know this, and okay, so it is a big problem. But I detect a note of lack of hope. Okay, and yeah. On that point, there are a pair of economists, I believe, at Princeton that have come up with this wedge hypothesis, this wedge idea, where using existing technologies, we can chip away at the excess CO2 input to the atmosphere by employing something like a dozen different strategies at the same time. So if there is the political will, and it has to last a lot longer than a couple of administrations, right, then there are smart people out there that think it is possible and that there is still some hope.
Well, for clean energy, I think we're up against the wall. We'll have to go nuclear. I hate to say it, but I don't see much choice. And you mentioned Jimmy Carter earlier. Jimmy Carter also stopped the program for reprocessing nuclear energy, but France kept on. France is running along fine with 80-90% of their energy from nukes.
They put all their nuclear plants on their eastern border, which is pretty interesting. I live okay. We're back.
For a more immediate solution, and sticking to the hydrocarbon world, does natural gas, help in any sense? There's quite a bit of an abundance of natural gas, in this, universe as far as North America is concerned. If we were able to switch over to a more predominant natural gas burning, fuel society, would we benefit in any immediate way as far as CO2 emissions?
Yes, the answer is yes. It's about 50%, produces about 50% less CO2 to burn natural gas. And you're right, we have plenty of natural gas. We're now able to produce from shale formations by using horizontal drilling. The biggest problem, the country doesn't have an energy policy, and there's something like 28 agencies that govern the energy business, which runs on energy time, which is 20 to 30 years, according to John Hoffmeister, and our government works on our decision makers are on 2 to 4 year cycles, political time, and they just can't get the two together.
It should also be noted that there's good gas and bad gas in terms of their strategy for acquiring it. You can have oil-related or hydrocarbons that are in that direction, but there's also gas that is trapped in rocks that they call fracking, where they inject some pretty aggressive strategies where there's been large-scale problems in aquifer contamination. So there's different strategies for it, but gas is certainly better than
But the bulk of the natural gas doesn't have to be fracked.
No,
it's already there.
Exactly, but we just have to avoid the
huge quantities in storage right now.
There is, the idea that the energy companies have also Progress Energy gets the majority now from their energy resources out of natural gas. I think it's a good tendency. It's certainly the better strategy if we're hydrocarbon dependent.
Bad gas isn't fractured.
Yeah. Again, it's a smaller proportion, but it has a significant imprint.
Okay, I have a question. I sail a lot, and sailors look at the sky constantly. So we're pretty aware of everything that's going on up there, including our past our sails. But I would like to know how the chemtrails are affecting our environment. There's two issues. That's one issue, and they're definitely chemtrails. They cover the sky with clouds. The other issue is at 9/11, when they stopped the airplanes from flying, it cleared up in hours. So I don't see how it's not going to clear up in hours if we stop what we're doing today, you know, however that might happen. So if you could address mostly the chemtrails and the speed of CO2 leaving, I really...
Don't always believe what you see. Because you can't see it doesn't mean that it's still not there. It may dissipate from its particle mode, its aerosol mode, the chemtrail, but it's still probably there. It's still dispersed in the atmosphere.
It changes the entire sky. You can see circles around the sun when they blast the sky with chemtrails. I mean, it's obvious. It looks nuclear to me. I don't know what it is. We don't know. We can't find it. Do you have any idea what it is? They're out there spraying?
I take a magazine called The Skeptical Inquirer, and I think they said a few things about chemtrails, and
I can't speak to them.
I don't think I better go any farther.
Oh, but it prompts a question of climate engineering. What do people think about that as a technological distinction from energy utilization? Is that a strategy that we should be dealing with, climate engineering? You say no, why not? Do you believe that there's hidden consequences to it? Yeah, well, I think there's been a lot of evidence that risk is not. Energy companies don't shy away from risk.
Well, let's see how hot it gets.
So does anybody think energy, is climate engineering our solution? Because we're not going to be able to resolve our hydrocarbon need, whether it be oil, whether it be natural gas. We're still going to use till the end, and then we'll use till oil, and then we'll use till coal. That would be a natural strategy. But do we believe that there's something else? Is it either another alternative energy, or is it an engineering solution to deal with the climate changes of heating? For example, the sulfates in the atmosphere. People have projected seeding the clouds with sulfate so that you'll create basically a mechanism for cooling the earth.
Wait, are you asking us that question? Would anyone like to respond to that?
No one seems to have any.
Just a minute.
It's cooling the earth. They do it when it's cold and when it's hot. They don't distinguish.
Hello, everybody. From science fiction books and stuff, I was always fond of terraforming, and though we're not exactly there with the technology, and I'm not a proponent for it necessarily, but I'd like to throw it into the mix.
What is it?
The Genesis Project.
Terraforming is would be creating kind of like the way that you create a terrarium or have an aquarium. You do that for people. You create a protected environment. Usually a dome is the
That's going to be a little hard. That's the biosphere too.
I guess I'll point out the kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. He's going all the way. Somebody was saying, don't try to outsmart Mother Nature. Well, we're doing that right now.
Yeah.
I mean, are you guys getting wet? I'm pretty dry right now, even though it's raining out there. That's what Mother Nature wants to be as wet right now. So, if you think about it, we're already kind of running a climate engineering project right now just by putting out CO2 and everything else we're putting out into the atmosphere. Every species does a climate experiment, if you will. So, to a certain extent, we want to do climate engineering. Well, we already are. The trick is to do a climate engineering that we most trust and we believe will have the fewest repercussions that we don't like.
Re-engineering.
All right, let's take a couple more questions. We have two over here, and then let's do a wrap-up session. And then if you have any further questions, I believe the panelists will be able to stay around for 2 more minutes. So we'll start here with Eric.
Hi, my name is Eric Stewart. I actually write on creative loafing, and last year I did a blog post about what I found in the news for 2010. And some of the things that I have issues with is there was a report put out that the population of phytoplankton, one of the largest organisms on the planet that sequesters carbon dioxide for this planet, is phytoplankton. And they found that the population has dropped over by 40%, mostly due to global heating of the upper layers of the warming of the ocean. And a couple other things I found out is, in Russia, we had massive fires, and in Pakistan, we had massive flooding. They reached over to 129 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas of Pakistan. And over in California, they're reaching over 112, 114 degrees Fahrenheit. And so as a young man, listening to all this and listening to this man talk about population, and I've seen the chemtrails. I've seen them with my eyes. I've looked, and I understand the difference between a contrail and a chemtrail. So stuff is going on, and it's stuff that we're not really discussing. I guess my question to you is, in your best estimate, what do you think we should do personally on a personal scale? Like, should we be more active with our voice? What should we do? What can we do?
Ben, you want to take?
Yeah, I'll say one thing. These plastic bottles use 20 million barrels of oil a year to make these things. 20 million is about what we normally use every day in cars and trucks and everything. But there's something.
Are those, is that energy use, or that oil use, using byproducts that are created by the oil refining process, or is that dedicated using?
I think it's a byproduct of the oil refining.
It's part of the crude petroleum.
So it's using?
Yes.
Yeah. But we all like to have these oil.
One of the most important, I find one of the interesting aspects is conservation and mileage on cars is a phenomenally interesting idea that through personal conservation, you can actually limit a lot of energy usage. And so it's a personal choice. I think people have to make these personal choices, but you have to realize that there is so much wind against you, with population change. It does seem a little bit overwhelming.
Yeah, I have a question on...
Can I respond to the last one? Okay, thank you. Just 2 quick points, if I may. I read some amazing numbers the other day. In our cars, a gallon of gasoline produces about 2,500 kilocalories of energy. But that's the CO2 that's emitted to the atmosphere as a result of that burning 1 gallon of gas actually stores 40 million times that amount of energy over the course of its lifetime in the atmosphere. Okay, so gasoline truly is one way that we can cut. Second thing I'd like to say real quickly is that in terms of carbon footprint, European countries are generally about half of what we are in the U.S.
Related questions to what was brought up earlier about use of natural gas and about what alternative fuels could do to substitute for our use of carbon fuels. One, does anybody know what the actual loss is in our distribution system to get power from places where it's generated to our homes? I know that it's a major percentage. I don't remember off the top of my head. I think it might be, it's way higher than 20%. It might be 50 or 70% loss. And does anybody here have an accurate number on that?
Not off the top of my head, but I have a paper on exactly that. It was published in Science a couple of years ago, and I think your remembrance is very close.
It's addressing the question of efficiencies in everything that we do and have, and is the vitality of the resource. I think these are...
It's related to things we can do. So there are things that we can do, one related to that same question, and related to natural gas. If you were to use natural gas to heat with, directly consuming the gas where you're creating the heat, I believe the efficiencies on gas delivery are orders of magnitude higher. So just by thinking about what you do when you build your home, what you do when you choose to replace your water heater, what you do when you decide how to heat your home, you can make some impacts there by deciding what's the most efficient method of doing that. The other thing is, I have seen maps by Progress Energy or something saying that 80% of the state would have to be covered with solar panels to be able to substitute PV. But I suspect that that's also based on the amount they have to generate, not what you would have to generate from a panel on your roof that doesn't lose anything in transmission from your roof to your consumption. So that's just a couple of things to consider in terms of things we can do.
Yeah, I think there's two scales here, right? Of course, the personal scale, and then the national scale. Or I guess you'd call it even a third scale is the global scale. And so there has to be some energy policy eventually in the States.
Yeah, Bob Weisberg at our school gave a lecture to an environmental class last Friday, and he covered solar panels, windmills, and what he called water mills. And he did all the calculations. He used his own home as the base. And I don't remember all the numbers, but it came out very clearly that it was a losing proposition, money-wise, and you know what you have to pay for your kilowatts and so on. And the main problem is that he has buoys out here in the stream, out here in the Gulf. He has anemometers. He knows exactly what the wind speeds are out there. About half the time, these things won't turn fast enough to make a significant amount of electricity. And even if they were producing what they're supposed to, they would have to be lined up 3 deep from Tallahassee to Key West. And of course, nobody's going to want to look at those things out there. That's the biggest problem with windmills. A lot of people just can't stand to look at them for reasons I don't quite understand. Then the solar panels were a problem. If you just completely cover the house, well, you're going to have to have a lot of batteries. You have to store it. It's complicated because
you need to store it if you use it right away. That's kind of his point.
And what?
Said you don't need to store it if you use most of the power right away. That's sort of his point.
And then turn the lights out and go to bed when it gets dark.
No one ever said solar panels had to be your only source of power.
No. Oh, I think they're great as a backup. And boy, they're great on sailboats, and you see them all the time you drive along the road. They got these panels on these telephones and so on. There's great use for those, but they don't give us the raw power that we need to keep all our computers running.
I think this is something there was a fellow that came to Vincent Dolan, who was the head of Progress Energy. He said a very interesting fact that 20 years ago you went into a home and you'd have 5 appliances hooked up into the wall. And now you have 25 appliances hooked up into the wall. So there's an enormous demand that we are demanding.
Alrighty then. Well, I think we're coming to a close here. I welcome anyone to stay longer and ask our panelists any questions you may have. Do you have any closing comments from the panelists or from the moderator?
I do.
Okay.
Actually. I would like to read something to you. It is from an acceptance of an award by the American Geophysical Union, the Roger Revelle Medal. And as you may know, Roger Revelle was sort of the administrator in the 50s at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, who oversaw the establishment of the CO2 measuring facility at that institution. So the award is named after this pioneer and this champion of science. And the award was given this past year to Peter Tons. And Peter Tons has made a career out of very precise measurements of atmospheric CO2 and its isotopic composition. And he has historically not become involved in discussions of policy or implications for policy, etc. he's changed his mind recently, and I want to read you just a few sentences from his acceptance speech. It says, "As climate scientists, we now find ourselves in the situation that our subject is widely understood to be so relevant to society that many powerful interest groups feel threatened. Thus, we are facing a well-organized and well-funded attack on our science and our integrity, spreading confusion and disinformation. This is not surprising, as mitigating climate change goes to the core of our energy supply system and the broader economic system. Human-made climate change demonstrates that we cannot continue business as usual. Should we ignore the deliberate lies and manipulations we face and stick purely with the science, hoping that sound judgment and compassion will eventually prevail? We are scientists, but we are also citizens. It is our civic responsibility to redouble our efforts to convey to the public clearly the urgency and the essence of the climate change problem. The kind of world we leave to our children and grandchildren depends on it." And I just really like this, and I think it is a challenge to educators and scientists across the board to do a better job of communicating to the public. And so I applaud Howard, the Peer Aquarium, and Emily for this series. This whole series looks like a great item for communicating science to the public. So thank you.
I'd like to follow up with what you said about Roger Revelle. He once had a student in his class that believed it all, and he ran off with it big time. His name was Al Gore. Yeah, I would like to second what Ben just said. It's been a really interesting group. And let's see, what else? One thing that wasn't mentioned tonight, and hiding back here, is that our new dean is on board, and her husband, I think, right here. This is Dr. Jacqueline Dixon, and she just became the new dean of the College of Education.
David, any comments? No? No. All right. Well, again, thank you everyone for coming out tonight. And don't forget to check a tick mark in the back of the room, hopefully next to an action that you will take in this next year. And Emily would also like to say a couple words.
Please, I will be sending a link to a Survey Monkey that'll come out to you tomorrow. Please respond. Please do the survey, because that's the only way we're going to know what you guys want to know about. We have quite a few people here, so let's all spend a few minutes, do the survey, send it back. I will also, I thank you all for coming, do the survey, and thank you. Have fun.
Mark, can you hear me at the bar? Can you hear me over there at the bar? Perfect, perfect. All right. So thank you, Jeff. Thank you. The two words climate change have different meanings for different people, and people have different opinions, obviously, about this. People react with caution, fear, skepticism, or not at all. You know, tonight's theme, we said, is Al Gore right? Does climate change exist? Should we be concerned living on a coastal city? We also have Frank Muller-Carter. Where's Frank? Frank is the director of the International Oceans Institute here in St. Pete. And in 2012, we're going to be hosting the second annual Coastal City Summit that deals with climate change issues. So if you're interested, please talk to Frank afterwards. And what should we do living in a coastal city? We hope that tonight's Sci Cafe will clarify the controversy And our format tonight, if you haven't been to a Sci Cafe before, this is very informal. This is not a lecture. We're here to have one-way, two-way, three-way, four-way conversation with everyone. So we're going to briefly introduce the topic. We'll take questions from the audience, and then we hope the discussion continues afterwards over a drink. I affectionately call it a drinking thing. So we encourage you to stay as long as you'd like, and our panelists and our moderator would stay as well, as long as you have questions or opinions. Speakers will speak for about 5 minutes. We'll be moderated by Dr. David Hollander here. And then afterwards, again, we'll take questions, and I'll walk around with the mic. David will acknowledge people. And then Emily, where's Emily over here, is going to ring the bell if she feels you're talking too long, or if the panelists are talking too long. We also have an exercise for all of you to participate in. I love it. Emily's making me say all this. Afterwards, we have an exercise for everyone to participate in. As I mentioned at the first night in Labyrinth, we had a series of 8 suggested actions that we wanted our participants to say, I want to take this action or that action or this action. Emily, where are those?
They're on that back table.
Okay, they're on the back table. Before you leave, after the discussion, we'd like for you to put a tick mark next to the action that you would like to take over the next year. That would hopefully offset or impact
Your carbon footprint.
your carbon footprint.
And we will compare these results with the people who attended our Labyrinth and voted during first night. So it'll be interesting. We had about 2,000 people who voted, so it'll be interesting.
Yeah, so please check our website for the results. www.pureaquarium.org. Our moderator tonight is David Hollander. David is an associate professor of chemical oceanography at the University of South Florida, College of Marine Science. You can see our College of Marine Science right behind us in the vista. Eugene Shin is also one of our panelists. He's a Curtis Professor of Geology at the University of South Florida, College of Marine Science. And Dr. Shin recently retired as a research geologist from one of our partners, the United States Geological Survey, where he started and directed the Fisher Island Station off of Miami. He did extensive geological research, including coral reefs, carbonate sediment production, Pleistocene geology, and environmental effects of offshore petroleum drilling. Before that, he had a 15-year career as a research geologist with Shell Oil Company, working in Florida, the Bahamas, the Persian Gulf, and Holland. His specialty at present is to study the effects of African dust on downwind ecosystems, including Caribbean coral reefs. So, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Hollander, and I'll be back with you at the end.
Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to thank Howard, Emily, and the Sci Cafe for the invitation. I appreciate it, and thank you, everybody, for coming. I think the concept of climate change is highly, it's a highly charged word. And the idea is that if climate change actually is occurring, the impact to the world can be severe. Not only is the idea that large climate changes or large levels of sea level would cause variability, but predictions of relatively modest changes are going to cause significant changes to our business as usual, our scenario of
this year. Who attended first night downtown? Anyone? The Pier Aquarium hosted a labyrinth this year, and the theme of the labyrinth was climate change. We had students from Eckerd College actually develop messages that were streamed throughout the labyrinth related to climate change, and then we also had elementary school kids from our Title I schools decorate luminary bags that decorated the labyrinth as well. So it was a wonderful project. We've taken that theme, we're bringing it to you tonight, and anticipate an interesting and lively conversation, to say the least, about this environmental issue. First, I'd like to recognize our sponsors for this evening, the American Chemical Society and our food partner, the Hangar Restaurant Light Lounge. We have Steve Westfall over here. And his lovely St. Nancy. We'd also like to thank Dave and Elizabeth and all the Hangar staff for accommodating us tonight. I'd also like to thank Jeff Wolf over here Jeff, raise your hand. Jeff, for those of you who have attended side cafes in the past, one of the major issues we've always had is with our PA system. Tonight we're borrowing Jeff's PA system. Hopefully this is much better than what we used in the past. Can everyone hear us in the back? Here, Dr. Hollander researches how biological, chemical, and physical processes and modern environments control the production, composition, alteration, decomposition, and preservation of organic matter. We'll talk more about that. This research couples state-of-the-art analytical techniques in stable isotopes and organic geochemistry to provide a detailed characterization of organic matter. Our panelists. Oh, give a round of applause for Dr. David Hollander. Our panelists include Benjamin Flower. Dr. Flower is an associate professor of paleoceanography and paleoclimatology. Dr. Flower's research focuses on the role of ocean circulation in past global climate change. He uses ocean sediment cores to examine the causes and effects of natural climate variability. The composition and geochemistry of ocean sediments are used to reconstruct sea surface temperature, salinity, carbon chemistry, and even iceberg delivery. Dr. Flower is currently working on several projects which include climatic and hydrologic variability in the Gulf of Mexico and Florida since the last glacial maximum, the role of Laurentide ice sheet meltwater in abrupt climate change, that's a mouthful, solar radiance forcing of iceberg delivery and climate in the North Atlantic, and the impact of the BP oil spill on sediments and benthic communities on the West Florida shelf and slope. Dr. Shin